Ursula Rumin was a dancer in revue and cabaret. By 1952, she'd landed a job as a scriptwriter with the state-owned film company, DEFA.
Dann hatte ich bei der DEFA
I had a contract with DEFA on a movie called The Destinies of Women.
Und das war also eine Geschichte.
The story was about women in East Berlin and women in West Berlin.
In Ostberlin die Frauen.
The women in the East would be politically orientated and organized.
Organisiert. Und politisch ausgerichtet, und in Westberlin waren das nur
Those in West Berlin would only be little dolls who cared about nothing but jewelry and fashion.
Und gab
Obviously, the East Berlin authorities wanted to show that life was good only in the East, and everything in the West was corrupt.
Und im Westen ist alles Tand.
The Destinies of Women, filmed on the streets of East Berlin, was released in 1952. The regime wanted such films to help build socialism, and Ursula's employers now wanted her to become a communist.
The chief scriptwriter asked me why I wasn't a member of the party.
Berlin was then the espionage capital of the world. And for those like Ursula living and working on this front line of the Cold War, East Germany could be a lawless place.
Einfahrender Zug nach Potsdam, über Friedrichstraße Westkreuz nach Potsdam.
Ich fuhr zur Friedrichstraße, ich wurde an der Friedrichstraße.
I went to the Friedrichstraße. There, two gentlemen addressed me by name, inviting me to get into their car, telling me that they would take me to my work at DEFA.
Mich zur DEFA zu bringen. Sondern die Fahrt dauerte ziemlich lange.
We drove very fast for quite a while. I was a bit surprised by this because my office wasn't that far away. I'd been kidnapped and nobody knew.
Protesting her innocence, Ursula was sentenced to 15 years hard labor for espionage by a military court and transported almost 2,000 miles away to a labor camp in Vorkuta, Siberia.
Es liegt ja am Eismeer, 30 Kilometer.
We were close to the Polar Sea. There was a wind with ice crystals.
Fast noch schlimmer war der Sommer.
The summer was almost worse.
Aber die Tundra in der
The tundra around Vorkuta was a marshland. There were hordes of mosquitoes.
Zerstochen wurden, aber dann bei 45
To work in 45 degrees centigrade heat, without sun protection, without water for 12 hours every day.
From 1945 onwards, tens of thousands were sent from eastern Germany to Siberia, many of them never to return. Ursula, one of the lucky ones, was released in 1954, still protesting her innocence. Only years later would she reveal that she had in fact worked for British intelligence since before her arrival in Berlin.
I would do errands for the English.
Für die Engländer gemacht.
I worked as a courier. In retrospect, it seems very naive. I don't understand how I could have been that stupid.
6 months after Ursula's kidnap, on the 17th of June 1953, the workers rose up against the workers' and peasants' state. What had begun as a strike amongst construction workers over pay soon turned into wider demands for free elections and the resignation of the government itself. By late morning, Soviet troops stationed in East Germany had to intervene.
Und dann war das so ungefähr 11:30.
At 11:30 we heard the tanks, the chains of the tanks. Then we realized the Russians were coming. The crowd started howling.
So zu den Tribünen stand, kamen die von rechts.
And when the people at the end of the demonstration refused to give way, the soldiers fired in the air. And when you hear gunfire, you start running automatically.
Dann rennen sie automatisch.
Horst Krieter, a Berlin petrol pump attendant, was in the thick of the action that day.
Ich weiß noch, rechts von dem Marx-Engels-Platz stand ein...
We threw stones at the tanks.
Wir konnten ja immer in diese Trümmer verschwinden.
Seeing the tanks firing in your direction, the sheer sound of it causes you to piss in your pants.
Und der schießt. Bei uns auf den
Someone had died on the Marx Engels Square that day.
Zu Tode kommt, der wahrscheinlich überfahren worden.
He was run over by a tank.
Ausgang des Marx-Engels-Platz war.
There was a blanket and a wooden cross which said "Murdered by the Soviet Army."
Und da stand schon drauf, von den Sowjets ermordet. Für mich ist es ein Ehrentag.
It was a day of glory for me. We showed them what could be done. The police could do nothing. The government could do nothing. The secret police, the Stasi, could do nothing.
Over 50 civilians were killed that day. In the clampdown that followed, more than 20,000 were arrested, scores were executed. The country's leaders had been caught off guard. From now on, security and the control of the people would be the government's overriding concern. The people themselves were concerned about simply getting by. The 1950s were austere times, and food and goods were in limited supply. Families and organizations in West Germany sent aid packages to the east.
We
were so happy and surprised as we lived such a frugal life. When the package arrived, we couldn't believe our eyes. The wrapping was so attractive and colorful. We'd never seen anything like this. Roland, the youngest, couldn't open the presents fast enough, helping Wolfgang beaming at his discoveries.
Mein Vater hatte also 1954.
In 1954, my father received the 8mm camera 8K8. These are the first films he recorded at Christmas.
1954, hier sieht man. Und der Kleine, das bin ich.
I'm the baby, 18 months old. That's his self-made gramophone. We lived in Berlin in Karlshorst, which was under Soviet occupation. Only state functionaries and those employed in ministries were allowed to live there. My father worked in television as a cameraman. He was, of course, a member of the party, but he wasn't totally convinced about it. My mother's wearing a necklace. Of course, that's only for the film. Now she's trying out the new vacuum cleaner.
Omega hieß der.
It's called the Omega.
Der wurde ungefähr so fast 20 Jahre produziert.
It was East Germany's people's vacuum cleaner.
Der Volksstaubsauger in der DDR. Oder wenn wir mit der Schulklasse in Berlin-Karlshorst noch 1960.
In 1960, Khrushchev came to East Germany.
Die DDR. Und da sind die auf der Rückfahrt zum Flughafen Schönefeld.
When he passed through Karlshorst on his way to the airport, my class and I had to wave.
Winken. Und erst viel später, wo ich mal die Bilder mal...
Only much later, when I developed the film and got it back home, I realized I'd waved at Erich Milke, the head of the Stasi, who was sitting next to the driver.
Der saß nämlich vorne neben dem Fahrer. Also in den 50er Jahren war man natürlich im Westen.
In the 1950s, people had few creature comforts.
Man hatte sich also für jedes gefreut, was nicht jeden Tag gab.
We were happy when we got hold of goods which weren't available every day, like bananas, which we bought in the West. Before 1961, it was still possible to drive into West Berlin.
Nach West Berlin fahren.
On August the 13th, 1961, construction began on the Berlin Wall. East Germany called it an anti-fascist protective wall designed to keep the West out. In fact, it was built to lock East Germans inside their socialist paradise. Around 3 million of them had already fled to the West, threatening the very existence of East Germany. One of those preventing people from escaping was Hagen Koch, the young pioneer at Dresden, who was now a member of the expanding Ministry of State Security known as the Stasi.